Hi there, my name is Miss Townsend and I love math. Welcome to Math with Townsend. This video is for grade 10 students who are working on the summative part of the course. It's question number 1 from those 18 summative questions, and just for clarification, it's question number 1 from the version that was distributed in May of 2013. So let's go ahead and look at that first question. It says, in a provincial mathematics examination, the average mark of those who passed was 64%, and of those who failed was 43%. If the average mark of all 840 students who participated was 58%, how many passed? So we have really three statements here about average. The average mark of those who passed, of those who failed, and of all students. So we average calculations are going to obviously be a major part of this question. So let's make sure we understand clearly what it means by average. So first of all, in the world of math, we often use the word average when we actually are referring to the calculation that's formally known as the mean. Average could actually refer to both mean and median and something called mode. But in this case, it's pretty clear that average is talking about mean. And let's review what that calculation looks like. For example, if you wanted to find out your average mark on a series of tests, and your teacher doesn't do anything special or fancy, you could add up, find the sum of all your marks and divide by the number of marks, and that would give you your average mark. Similarly, if I was finding out the average height of 10 students, I would measure all of their heights, add those numbers together, and divide by 10 because that's the number of students, and that would give me my average height. So generally, we're all pretty comfortable with the idea of how to calculate average. So let's reread the question and make note of anything we have to make note of. So again, we have the average mark of those who passed was 64%. So here's what I've done. If the average mark of those who passed was 64%, I've set up this equation. I know that the total number of marks from passing students divided by the total number of passing students, that would be my calculation for calculating average, and the average is 64%. I also know that the average of those who failed was 43%. So again, if I took the total marks of all the failing students and divided by the number of failing students, I would get 43. And then the third calculation implied is that the total number of marks of all students divided by the total number of students is 58, because that's the overall average. So those are the three average calculations that are suggested in the word problem. And the only thing I can add, the only piece of information I have in the words is the fact that there were 840 students. So that number I can add here. Total number of students is 840. So let's use that information and we'll complete this purple calculation a little more carefully. So going to the next page, here we have, again, the total number of marks. I don't know what that is, but I do know that there were 840 students. So let's go ahead and do this calculation. I'll use T temporarily to represent total. So total number of marks divided by 840 is 58. So if we do a little fancy cross multiplication, we find that T is 48,720. So if you took every single mark given to every kid involved in this math competition, there would be a total of 48,720 marks given out to the 840 students, and that means that there was an average of 58. Okay, so now I know what goes on top. So now I know that, let me clean this up a little bit. I know that the total number of marks, actually I'll go to another page, bear with me for just a second. Let's go down to a nice page. Boom. And we'll paste. Okay. So I don't need to see this anymore. I've used that. Oh. Okay, sorry. We know that the total number of marks is 4,8,720. And we know that the total number of students is 840. So this is really the only information we have. So let's see what we can do with this information. So we know, let me borrow this. Oops. Oops. Okay. Oops. we know this, that the total marks of passing students, blah, blah, blah. And we have a similar thing for failing students. Let me go grab that. Sorry, I'm using a touch screen computer with a finger sensitive mouse and a tablet. So sometimes I'm not sure who's doing what. Okay, here we go. So we have this. Now, I don't know what any of the green numbers are. Total marks of passing students, total number of passing students. I have no idea. Nor do I know the total marks of failing students or the total number of failing students. But here's what I do know. I know that if I took the total marks of the passing students, so if I knew this number and I added it to the total marks of the failing students, so if I took those two numbers and added them together, so all the marks obtained by the passing students and all the marks obtained by the failing students, I would get this. I would get the total number of marks of all students, which is 48,720. So that means I can talk about the relationship between the total number of passing students and the total number of failing students. Similarly, if I were to take the total number of students who passed, so if I knew what this was, and I don't, but let's pretend I did, and I were to add to it the total number of students who failed, then I would have 840. Because of all those who passed plus all those who failed, well, that must be all students. So again, I don't know what this is, total, and I don't know what this is, but I know that together they add to 48,720. I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is, but I know that together they add to 840. So that's the information I'm going to use to identify my variables. Because if I, for example, decide to call this, oh, let's just say x, then I can call this 48,720 minus x. Does that make sense? Have a look at the math, right? If this is 100, then this is everything else. If this is 1,000, this is everything else. So that shows me the relationship between those two values. Similarly, down below, if I let the total number of passing students, if I decide to call that y, then there must be 840 minus y failing students. And again, because if I add them together, I get 840. If this is 500, this is 840 minus 500, and so on. So that helps me kind of think about where my variables are going to sit. So let's start actually formally answering this question. Okay, so I've got a nice clean page in front of me, and let's define. I'm going to let x be the number of marks assigned to students who passed the exam. So x, and again, I'm just doing what I thought about doing here. Total marks of passing students is x. So let x be the number of marks assigned to students who pass the exam. And of course, I could have put the total of the marks, whatever. And I'm going to immediately put therefore 48,720 minus x is the number of marks assigned to students who failed. And again, how do we know that? We know from this calculation that there were a total of 48,720 marks assigned. If x of them went to the passing students, then 48,720 minus x must have gone to the failing students. So similarly, we're going to define y. So let me pull blue. We're going to let y be the number of students. Oops, hold on. Who passed the exam. And therefore, this many students, oops, failed. Okay, why are we erasing the exam? So again, that's the information we got when we were thinking here, that if Y students passed, then 840 minus Y students failed, because we know that there were a total of 840 students. So we've defined two variables, X and Y. Now let's use them to set up some questions, or sorry, some equations. So we know, and we know that the average of those who passed was 64. So let me just borrow this again. We know this. Pardon me. I'll just take a quick copy. Boop, 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 boop. So we know this. That the total marks of passing students divided by total number of passing students. So therefore, based on what we've just defined, X over Y equals 64. We know that. And another way of writing that is I could cross multiply and make it a little simpler and say that X equals 64 times Y. So again, this is the total number of marks assigned to passing students, and this is the total number of students who passed. So X divided by Y is 64, or we could say that X equals 64 times Y. Now we're going to do something similar with the students who failed. So let's go grab that information. So here it is, the students who failed. Let's grab a copy of this. Go to the page we're working on. Here we go. So again, we know we've now defined variables that represent things. So the total number of marks assigned to failing students was 48,720 minus X, and the total number of failing students was 840 minus Y. And again, I'm just going to cross multiply so that I don't have to deal with fractions. So 48,720 minus X equals 43 times 840 minus Y. So 48,720 minus X equals 43 times 840. Oops. 36,120, 36,120 minus 43y. So again, this is an equation involving the letters x and y. Here's an equation involving the letters x and y. So what we have is two equations involving two unknowns. So let's grab both of those equations and figure out how we're going to solve, because we should be able to solve two equations and two unknowns. And let's see how to do it. So grab this, copy, and paste. Okay. So there's my two equations. I'm going to label them 1 and 2. Now the question is, how are we going to solve? Well, we know from chapter 1 of grade 10 math that we can solve by elimination or substitution. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to isolate x so that I can have x isolated both here and here. And then we'll figure out how to solve from there. So I'm going to subtract 48,720 from both sides. So I'll have negative x equal, I don't want to write in red. I'll have, let me get rid of that. Negative x equals 36,120 minus 43y minus 48,720. So what does that give me? 36,120 minus 48,720. That gives me negative 12600 minus 43y. So now I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1 and put it into a nicer looking order. There. There's a nicer looking version of equation 2. There we go. And again, up here, I have equation 1, and they both are written explicitly for x. So you can solve by elimination or substitution. I guess I'll do substitution. So I know that 64y is 43y plus 12,600. So subtract 43y. 21y equals 12,600. So y equals, drum roll, 600. So we earlier learned that y represents number who passed was y. So we now know that 600 students passed. And therefore, this many students, which is 240, failed. Now, what was it I actually had to discover in this question? Here. Well, all it says is how many passed. Well, we already calculated that. We know that y calculated out to be 600. So 600 students passed, and we now know that 240 failed. So we're done the question. A little bit of a tricky word problem, but once you see kind of how it works, it's not that bad of a question. You just have to define your variables properly, and this question works out wonderfully. Okay, so I hope that helped, and I'll see you in class. Bye.